Thank you all for being back. It's kind of freaky how you go silent all of a sudden just for no reason, but thank you for being here. Thank you for being back. How many of you have been to every session today? Look at that. Look at you guys in front. Well done. Thank you. Thanks for being here. I did want to mention from the previous panel, and it will apply to this panel as well, that unfortunately Mike Freeman, who was supposed to be with us for the previous panel, had a family emergency and couldn't make it. And for this panel, Dave Zirin also is unable to make it because of family emergency, but Dave has sent comments ahead of time, and the moderator will be sharing some of those comments as she begins the panel. So this is our final panel of the day. And again, this one ties together a thread we've been talking about all day, issues of sport and politics. Are those inseparable? Should they be separated? How do they intersect with each other? So this panel delves into the political dimensions of sport, focusing on how states, corporations, and governing bodies use major sporting events to project power, shape narratives, and very often obscure human rights abuses. This is a practice often referred to as sports washing. From the Olympics and FIFA World Cup to Formula One and regional tournaments, sport has become a high-stakes arena where geopolitical interest, public image, and economic power converge. This panel will look at global case studies and on-the-ground perspectives to critically examine how can sport be reclaimed as a space for accountability, transparency, justice, and the promotion of human rights. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and the co-organizer of this summit, Dr. Erica LaPlante, who will be the moderator for this panel. Erica is director of our Human Rights Research Hub in the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute, and she's a postdoctoral research associate in human rights engagement at the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute. She received her PhD in political science here from the University of Connecticut in May 2022. Her dissertation examined how different regulatory models governing sex workers impacted their rights in both Nevada and New South Wales. So I will turn it to Erica to introduce the panelists, but please join me at this point in welcoming the panel and Erica.
Thank you, Jim. I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel today on a timely topic on sports washing and human rights. And just as a housekeeping reminder, we're going to have the same format as the earlier panels today. I'm going to start the panel by posing an opening question and ask each of you to take 10 minutes to respond. And from there, we'll open it up into a discussion among all of us as the panelists. And we'll leave the last 15 to 20 minutes for audience Q&A. And we've got a timekeeper up here in the front, so they'll signal you when you've got 1 minute left in your 10 minutes. So I'd like to briefly introduce each of our panelists, but I encourage you all to look at the program for their full bios. I'll start with Minky Worden. Minky is the Director of Global Initiatives at Human Rights Watch, where she develops, implements international outreach and advocacy campaigns. She previously served as the media director at Human Rights Watch, working with journalists to cover crises, wars, human rights abuses, and political developments in over 90 countries. Jules Boykoff is the author of 6 books on the politics of the Olympics. He has written for The Guardian, The Los Angeles Times, The Nation, The New York Times, as well as academic journals such as the Sociology of Sport Journal and the International Journal of the History of Sport. A former professional soccer player, he teaches political science at Pacific University in Oregon. Colm Kearns is assistant professor in the School of Communications at Dublin City University. His research interests include the intersection of sport, media, and politics, online harms, and the evolving relationship between the media and national identity. His most recent research is with the Tackling Online Hate in Football project. And finally, David Francis is the Vice President of Global Growth and Strategy in Government Affairs at Jetter Global Sports and Entertainment, leveraging decades of experience in global sports. Previously, he spent 14 years at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, where he managed government affairs, foreign relations, and athlete support across 7 Olympic and Paralympic Games. One of our panelists, as Jim mentioned, Dave Zirin, the sports editor of Nation magazine, unfortunately is not able to join us today, but he did share some remarks so we could include him in this discussion. To frame our conversation, Dave called specifically for a conceptualization of sports washing that's not limited to autocratic regimes, but one that critically examines sports washing in democracies, including at home in the US. He shared, quote, "The definition of sports washing that is most important is that it's not used to project a false image abroad, for example, a country that's hosting the Olympics that is also a brutal autocracy, but that sports washing is also used to smash opposition in democracies and at home here in the US. A country presents an image to the world that it is a modern nation for human rights, a place where everyone can come and have fun and spend their money. And then that is really where the freedom ends." So with this framing and this definition from Dave in mind, I want to pose the first question to our panelists. And that is, what responsibilities do athletes, fans, and institutions have when sport is used to justify or distract from political injustice and human rights abuses? And I'll ask Jules if you will kick us off. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erica, for your leadership here today and for everyone who's done all the work to make this happen. This has been wonderful. I define sports washing, like my close friend and colleague, Dave Zirin, as when political leaders use sports to appear important or legitimate on the world stage while stoking nationalism and deflecting attention from domestic social problems and human rights woes that are happening at home. So sports washers use sports to try to burnish the national prestige while at the same time trying to convey economic and political success. Analysis of sports washing tends to fall into two different forms of intellectual quicksand. One is ideological, the other analytical. Ideologically, it tends to get thrown, the term sports washing, at authoritarian countries rather than democracies. But sports washing can also emerge in democratic political spaces, as well as what political scientists are increasingly calling the new competitive authoritarianism. That's when you have the outward trappings of a democracy, the institutions appear to be intact, while coexisting with extreme and sometimes illegal activities from the government itself and elections that seem to be okay on the outside, but that are actually rigged. So there's actually some debate as to whether, among political scientists, as to whether the United States currently is sliding into this new competitive authoritarianism or democracy. But either way, I'm going to make the argument that what we're seeing right now in the United States is a quintessential example of the practice. Now, on the analytical quicksand side, that's when people ask if sports washing works. What they usually mean is on a global audience. And yet sports washing is incredibly important when it comes to domestic audiences in the home country where these events are happening. Sports mega events are extremely popular, and organizers and politicians try to use them to sort of capture a halo effect, if you will, to place on their own heads. In addition, and importantly, national governments and local governments use sports mega events like their own private cash machine to get all the special weapons and laws that they'd never be able to get if it weren't for the fact of the sporty political state of exception. And let's be clear, as I said before, we are currently witnessing all these dynamics very much unfolding in the United States right now. Donald Trump's use of sports for political purposes is unprecedented in the history of the United States presidency. No other president even compares. Trump's using the 2026 FIFA World Cup and the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles to burnish his reputation globally, to try to convey economic and political success. And he's also using the Los Angeles Olympics in particular to give him a chance to stick it to arch rivals, political arch rivals like California Governor Gavin Newsom and LA Mayor Karen Bass. To his base, sports allowed Trump to look like he's, quote, owning the libs, whether through uncouth comments about Gavin Newscum or by recycling racist reframings about how low IQ mayors of different African-American mayors of different cities are causing him trouble. And I should say in particular, he tends to lob this low IQ phrase at accomplished Black women. LA 28 Olympic organizers still need billions in transportation dollars to make this event happen. Billions. They haven't got the approval from the federal government yet. So Trump has leverage over all these people, and you think he's not going to use it? It's important to also note that sports washing in the United States is a bipartisan affair. Democrats have been more than happy to assist. And we can see this if we look a little bit more carefully at the LA 28 Olympics. With Los Angeles 28, there are at least 4 ways that officials, not just Trump, are using the Olympics to sports wash. First, Democratic leaders argued that hosting the Olympics would help them solve homelessness. Speaking on late night TV, then Mayor Eric Garcetti said, I'll quote him, "I'm confident by the time the Olympics come, we can end homelessness on the streets of LA." Karen Bass, when she was campaigning to become mayor, struck a similar chord when she said, quote, "I do believe that when the Olympics comes in 2028 and I'm mayor, there won't be homeless encampments." When she said that at the mayoral debate, they literally laughed. The moderator guffawed directly after she said that. Now, this is an interesting variation to me on sports washing in the sense that they're not yet deflecting attention from these. In the original, they used it to say, we're going to actually use the Olympics to address them. But you can bet soon enough, I'm sorry to say, I wish it were true, that homelessness is not going to be solved by the time the Olympics rolls around in Los Angeles. Then they're going to get into deflection mode. Second, after the horrific fires in Altadena and the Pacific Palisades in January 2025, both Governor Newsom and Casey Wasserman, who's the head of the Los Angeles 2028 organizing committee, said that because they're hosting the Olympics, it would actually help jumpstart the rebuilding effort in these communities. Even though there was scant evidence of this, in fact, I haven't even seen any good evidence of this, to be honest. But the idea that hosting this event would actually help. Of course, they're going to back away from that as we get closer to the event and start deflecting attention from that as well. Third, electeds are using the Olympics in Los Angeles to try to create their own personal political trampoline. It's not just Trump. Newsom is using the event for those purposes. Eric Garcetti, the former mayor, tried to do the same with very little effect, I must say. And fourth, and I would maybe say this is the most important way that we're seeing the effects of sports washing in Los Angeles, is that it's kickstarting the security state. For example, former President Joe Biden designated the 2028 Olympics a National Special Security Event, or an NSSE. Sounds boring, but it's really important. He did this in 2024, some 4 full years ahead of the Olympic Games. That's a record if you're counting for National Special Security events. Well, what does this mean? Well, for starters, it means the NSSE is already in effect. More specifically, by being in effect, what it means is that numerous national intelligence and security bodies have wider latitude to operate in the city of Los Angeles as they get ready to host the Olympic Games. More precisely, that means the Department of Homeland Security has freer reign in Los Angeles, and its preeminent policing body, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has freer reign in Los Angeles right now. ICE, as you may have seen, this matters a lot when you have about 1 million undocumented residents in your city, as Los Angeles does. ICE has been marauding through Los Angeles, as I'm sure you've seen on your phone screens, at times looking like an invasion force. National Special Security Event status only emboldens impunity. The security crackdown on the ICE protests that we've seen in Los Angeles gives us a frontal view of what we might expect mega security to look like over the next 3 years. As you'll remember, it involved the National Guard and the Marines. The point I'm trying to make is that sport is enabling this crackdown. So sports washing is not just about soft power. It's also about amassing hard power that can be used to suppress political dissent. So I said before, sports washing is about deflecting attention. Well, what could President Trump, be deflecting our attention from? Well, there are his low approval ratings. AP has him at 37% approval ratings right now. There's the fact that 69% of U.S. adults feel the country is headed in the wrong direction. There's his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. There's the lingering inflation that he promised to fix on day one. There's the Ukraine-Russia conflagration that he also promised to fix on day one. There's the ever-weakening dollar. There's the fact that the U.S. is edging toward a recession. I could go on. He's deflecting from a lot of different things. So what responsibilities do athletes, fans, and institutions have in this context? First, the onus falls on the powerful institutions that govern world sport, like the International Olympic Committee or the IOC and FIFA. They could, and I say should, start by simply following their own rules, principles, and values. This might sound basic, but unfortunately, we cannot take it for granted. Taking a good hard look at their treatment of Israel illuminates this reality. During the Paris Olympics in 2024, numerous journalists asked me, why is Russia being asked to participate as individual neutral athletes and Israel's getting to participate under their flag and under their anthem? I would explain to them that Russia was banned, or their athletes were banned because, one, they broke the Olympic truce, and two, they had taken over territory in Ukraine and taken over the sports clubs in that territory. While history does not provide us with crisp facsimiles for perfect comparison, if we look at Israel, you can see that the Olympic truce, they hadn't broken it yet, but they did, of course. They didn't stop the war during the Olympics. And they had taken over territories inside of the West Bank where numerous soccer clubs, as Human Rights Watch, Minky's organization, has documented fully. And so that's why people were asking, why is Israel getting to participate under their flag? They've also violated openly a FIFA statute that forbids member associations and their clubs from playing on the territory of other member associations. And Palestine does have a group under FIFA. It's got its own organization, football organization. And so there's at least 8 Israeli football clubs that are participating to quote the United Nations, in Israeli colonial settlements of the occupied West Bank. So it's clear that both FIFA and the IOC are inconsistent when it comes to the application of their own principles and values. So in conclusion, the IOC and FIFA are racked by an internal contradiction. They say that they're against politics, but that's not only a convenient, flimsy fiction, it's become an excuse for them to ignore their own ethical responsibility to sports. It takes profound international pressure to get the IOC or FIFA to take action, but it can be done. Witness South Africa being banned from the Olympics from the 60s through the early 1990s. We all have a responsibility to challenge the human rights injustices that are happening in our backyard. For here in the United States, this means political education. This means standing up even when it's unpopular. And it also means widening the tent to fight against the new competitive authoritarianism and challenging the Trump administration's dogged efforts to sportswash. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jules. Minky?
Thanks very much. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Jules surfaced, but I wanted to begin with agreeing with the definition that Dave Zirin and Jules have presented, and it is sports washing as a definition involves using sports, particularly mega sporting events, which can have audiences of billions, to both wipe away human rights abuses at home and to project an image of strength abroad. I also want to say that the work that Human Rights Watch has done in particular has focused on how these mega events cause human rights abuses. So this isn't just a PR effort. The events themselves are the source of major human rights abuses. And I wanted to just say a few words about that because it's sports washing as a term is not just about PR. And I did want to say just this is a book and really a book tour that I did with Jules back at the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And at the time, it was said that there'd never be a larger or more expensive event. It was $52 billion, and it was seen as China's coming out party. But really, within just a few years, there was the Qatar World Cup that was $220 billion. So I would say also that the cost of these events, particularly with Saudi Arabia staging an upcoming World Cup, Morocco, Spain, Portugal staging the 2030 World Cup, the high cost of these events is also a consideration when we're talking about sports washing. I really the work that Human Rights Watch does as an organization is we really feel it's our job to document the high human costs of these events. So sports washing as a practice also has behind its very serious human rights abuses. And I wanted to pick up on the theme of the loss, of the what we call the perfect storm of major sporting events that are coming to the United States in 2026, the World Cup in the US, Canada, and Mexico, and then in 2028, the Los Angeles Olympics. And I think we could really look at this as the MAGAization of major sporting events, and we really need to talk about what that means in practice. And these events. It's very important to understand the original context of the World Cup in 2026 was that it was the first time FIFA had adopted the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. There was a human rights strategy. There's a group of stakeholders called Dignity 2026. We spent a lot of years working with FIFA to implement binding labor standards, non-discrimination, rights for journalists, rights of protest, rights for fans, and rights for athletes. So right now, what we're looking at is that the human rights strategy is a hollow document, and there are also supposed to be human rights strategies for each of the host cities. The host cities actually can't keep up with the Trump administration's announcements, including from Kristi Noem threatening that federal immigration officers would be all over Bad Bunny fans at the Super Bowl. I think that is certainly a warning sign for the World Cup, which will take place just a few months later. To say a few words about what we are documenting, there's a current U.S. immigration crackdown. None of this was foreseen when the World Cup was awarded to the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. We've got mass deportations and a militarization of host cities. This is also something that we have documented. We've done a series of reports on the use of excessive force against protesters. Los Angeles is an example of what the real human rights risks are. And just to say, the protests were in response to immigration, to protests over the arrest and deportation of communities there. So these are the communities that are actually going to deliver the World Cup. What are those communities? People have to stay in hotels. These are the workers staffing the hotels, staffing the stadiums, staffing the fan zones. These are the families that should be attending the World Cup. These are the communities that are going to be responsible. Normally, you'd have volunteers from the communities. So these are the communities that are most affected. And then, of course, whenever there's excessive force putting down protests, you then also have journalists. Journalists have to work at the World Cup. So it's actually your working environment. And I should mention that the risks that Human Rights Watch is documenting are both to those who would come to the United States. That's an entire set of people who are negatively affected by the World Cup in the US, Canada, and Mexico, which is more likely to exclude people from attending. So there right now are a dozen countries that are on the list of those visa bans. That includes Iran. So some of you know that Iran has already qualified for the Men's World Cup. Normally, there are Iranian women fans who travel to the World Cups because they cannot sit in stadiums in their own country to cheer their national teams. So no Iranian women fans will be coming to this country because there is a visa ban in place. So these are human rights consequences of U.S. government decisions. And then, of course, there LGBT people who wish to come to the United States, fans, players, entourage, journalists will have to, trans people will have to declare their birth gender while entering the United States. So these pose real risks for everyone who would come to the U.S. And then I would also say that the risks are even greater for those who are inside the U.S. And this includes, of course, family separations. It includes ICE at stadium areas, ICE in fan zones, and ICE in the hotels where people would stay when they attend. So there is, I think, when you think of how all human rights are interconnected, the World Cup in the U.S. and, of course, the Olympics in 2028 pose massive human rights risks that were not envisioned back in 2018 when the World Cup was awarded to the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. in response, I think it's important to say that there is in place at FIFA and for the World Cup sponsors a human rights framework, and it's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. FIFA adopted that framework and does have an obligation to do human rights due diligence. They have an obligation to monitor and adjust their own policies and use their leverage with the administration when it's clear that the situation on the ground has changed. The landscape for human rights is fundamentally changed. That means that FIFA has an obligation to mitigate risks to all of these communities. And then finally, we'll get to the general response, but I would say athletes cannot speak up individually in this newly pernicious environment, human rights environment, because they could be retaliated against, they could be denied the right to play. But national federations and unions must speak up. So those are collective groups. Host cities, some of them are standing up against what is effectively martial law. Nobody thinks you can conduct a enjoyable and successful World Cup in a situation of martial law. Fans can vote with their wallets and stay home, buy tickets in Canada, refuse to watch the World Cup. And journalists, I think, are going to have a very difficult time reporting this World Cup and reporting the human rights conditions in the United States. Typically, journalists who cover major sporting events don't just cover the sports, they cover the context of that country. So every sector that is involved in delivering this World Cup, workers, fans, families, communities, journalists, and athletes are negatively affected by the changed landscape for human rights in the United States.
Thank you, Mickey. Colm.
Yeah, so if you don't see Ireland at the World Cup in 2026, it's because we're protesting, not because we just didn't qualify because we're not very good. Excellent contributions from Minky and Jules, but if I may, I'll begin by breaking somewhat from the very useful definition Jules gave us to start off with on sportswashing. And I do think it is important to define these things. Very often it's for the likes of ourselves, we're kind of neck deep in this, and we tend to assume a level of familiarity that the average person has that they don't necessarily always have. But I think while I would agree with a lot of the definition that Jules provided, I think one of the difficulties of sportswashing is by its nature, it is a post facto term that we as scholars and journalists in the media as well impose on an event afterwards. It's very rare you have the people and the organizers, the regimes involved with those events self-identifying it as sportswashing. A very rare exception to this came when MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was having an interview with Fox News, and he sort of airily kind of dismissed, you can call it sportswashing if you like. I don't care what you call it, so long as it increases the GDP of the average Saudi Arabian citizen. So this was a very rare example of someone who was, essentially, he's not functionally the head of state, but he's really the power in Saudi Arabia, of even mentioning, sportswashing. Most of the time, the regimes, you didn't hear Russia in 2018 or Qatar in 2022, China in 2008 describing what they were doing as sportswashing. In fact, the term itself only really emerges in 2015 with the European Athletics Games in Azerbaijan. So all of this is to say that there's a certain level of speculation that any of us criticizing it have to engage in. We can't really know the motivations of the people behind it. We can speculate as to whether this is to improve their standing on the international stage, to maybe mollify elements at home who might otherwise be focused on other problems and so on. Maybe as if MBS is being honest with Fox News, maybe there is also an economic element there that does genuinely enrich these countries as well. But we who study it, we who critique it, can never truly know. But I don't think this should necessarily stop us from critiquing it. And myself and my colleagues published a paper on sportswashing about 2 years ago, specifically in relation to Manchester City, the English Premier League club that's essentially owned by Abu Dhabi, or rather the Abu Dhabi United Fund. It's functionally owned by Abu Dhabi. And we kind of, in looking at the literature, we found a lot of this argument about defining what exactly is sportswashing, is it selectively applied, and so on. And while I think there's a lot of benefit, particularly for us in the West, of kind of taking a long, hard look at the mirror and saying, are we very quick to apply this sportswashing term to regimes in the East and maybe not so much at home. And it's very kind of, I suppose, useful in this regard that both of you have applied it to the Los Angeles Olympics and the upcoming World Cup with regard to the US, and particularly this morning when it was applied to private individuals as well, such as billionaire owners of sports teams, sports franchises here in the US, who perhaps kind of hope to gain the meritocratic perception of sport will rub off on them. While I think that's all of that is really important, ultimately sports washing boils down to simply, we're all here because we love sport. Do we think that sport should be tainted in any way by associations with regimes, with individuals, with powerful bodies that, fundamentally impinge on and ignore and trample over human rights? And I would hope, the answer everyone in this room would have is no. And at that level, it doesn't really matter how exactly we define what the motivations behind the sports washing regime may be. We simply draw the line at, if a regime that tramples on human rights, they should lose the right to host, perhaps even participate in major sporting events. And I think that's where we should begin the conversation around what athletes, what fans, what institutions can do. That it's simply it's less based around the kind of sports washing as a strategy and more the human rights abuses committed by these regimes involved, and whether this means they should lose their right to participate to host these major sporting events. Just before I get into what fans, athletes, and institutions can do, I do want to make one key distinction that we arrived at in the paper we done on Man City, and that's between this what's called events-based sports washing, or what we called events-based sports washing, and investment-based sports washing. And events-based sports washing is where you have an autocratic regime who hosts a major sporting event, such as China hosting 2008 Olympics, Qatar hosting 2022 World Cup, Russia hosting 2018 World Cup, and so on. And at the time we were writing our paper, most of the research into sports washing had focused on these kind of events. And they're obviously incredibly key. These are among the major globally watched events in the world, command a huge audience, huge level of emotion. But if you think of your own relationship to these events as a sports fan, right, it is on some level perhaps easier to disentangle your relationship as a sports fan and your own queasiness about human rights involved. So if you were watching the World Cup in Qatar in 2022, many of you here from the US watching it, you're watching it, you love football, you want to watch a lot of the World Cup, you're also there watching as American fans, wanting the US team to do well and so forth. So there's a distinction in the sense of like, Qatar has the World Cup, but you are a fan of your team, and that is perhaps that identity is relatively untainted by the fact that the tournament, unfortunately, is being hosted in this country that has essentially slave labor on migrant workers and ignores LGBT and women's rights and so on. Investment-based sports washing is whereby a regime or individuals involved in trampling human rights invest long-term in a sports institution, such as a sports franchise, a sports club, and so on. So Abu Dhabi United, the Abu Dhabi United Fund owning Manchester City, Qatar essentially owning Paris Saint-Germain, the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund owning Newcastle United. These would be several examples, and probably many of you here in the US could speak to whether some of the ownership of individual billionaires over US sports franchises goes into this as well. And I think it's particularly it's an interesting one because it's much trickier to disentangle for us as sports fans, right? If you are a Man City fan, a Newcastle United fan, a PSG fan, or whatever, and your club suddenly gets owned by this regime you fundamentally disagree with on an ethical level, what do you do then? Do you stop supporting the club? Do you support the club under protest, maybe, organized protest and so on? It becomes a very tricky question, and one I don't think that anyone's necessarily arrived at a great answer to. But that brings me to actually answering the question Eric asked, which is what kind of responsibilities athletes, institutions, and fans can do about this. Well, on one level, I think their responsibilities are very simple. It's like simply a case of, the old saying that like all that has to happen for evil to succeed is for good men to do nothing. So any of us involved where we kind of see wrong done in terms of regimes who trample over human rights get involved in sport, we necessarily have to do something. And I think organization is key. It's very easy to feel powerless as sports fans. We all have kind of probably complaints ranging from the ticket prices at matches to ethical misdemeanors on behalf of the institutions that run our clubs and feel like, well, what can we do? Like, largely ignore us. But there are often examples where it succeeded, most notably in European soccer football in recent years with the collapse of the purported European Super League, which is sort of an amazing story that happens so quick we kind of take for granted, where you have these enormously wealthy, powerful players, players in the athletes, I mean players in terms of the institutions involved, trying to essentially hijack the structures of European football and make a closed shop whereby the select group of the richest clubs will play one another and the rich will get richer and so on. And if they have buy-in from those clubs, from several broadcasters and so on to air all this, and it collapses within days because of fans' protest. And I think, again, it happens so quick, it's easy for us to take for granted. But that is the power that fans can have. That, people, there's a great line in the English writer Nick Hornby's book, Fever Pitch, which is a memoir of his time as a football fan, where he talks about how, the football authorities think people watch football for footballers, but they don't really, or they don't just watch it for that. They watch it for the kind of whole culture around it. And we certainly saw this with all of sport during COVID, when sport was playing behind closed doors, and what an anemic, antiseptic experience it was, both for the athletes competing in it and for us as viewers watching it. So fans are essentially crucial to sports emotional value, but because of that, it's financial value as well. And if they essentially withdraw labor through protest, then they can achieve enormous things. This was proven in the Super League case. But organization is the key. Organization that cuts across countries, that cuts across rivalries between teams. So that's key to it for fans. And I think so too is the key to it for players. The talk yesterday with John Carlos and Tommy Smith, incredibly brave individuals, and they were asked at the end about, why aren't more players doing this now? And obviously they went into, frankly, harrowing detail about the amount that they and their loved ones had suffered for what they had done. And I think while probably a lot of us in this room would quite like to see more, high-profile athletes take a stand about human rights abuses, about causes close to our heart, we understand at the same time that I don't think any of us would feel right asking any athlete to go through what Tommy Smith and John Carlos went through after their protest in Mexico 68. So again, I think the key for athlete protest is a united front, is for it not be, a 1, 2, 3 individual athletes to protest, but for players' unions, athletes' unions, and so on to kind of facilitate and support groups of players in protesting, and that way make it more difficult to kind of punish or winnow out individuals. And for the institutions themselves, and I'm sure this is an ongoing frustration for Minky and her colleagues, is for them to see human rights and all involved as fundamental to sport rather than essentially an added extra. I think a lot of major sporting organizations, most notably FIFA, tend to talk about outside of both sides of their mouth when it comes to the power of sport and human rights and so on. When it goes right, when there's a good news story, they're very kind of quick to say, oh, isn't it wonderful? Sport can break barriers, sport can bring us all together. Then when they're expected to actually do something and act on something in terms of, should you remove the World Cup from the US because of what's going on with Trump's administration, so on. Should you remove the World Cup from Qatar because of the migrant slave labor there? Then suddenly they throw up their hands and say, oh, what can we do? We're just a sporting body, as if they have no power at all. So on the one hand, they talk about kind of sports and human rights relations, this fundamental, beautiful thing, and it's the most wonderful thing about sport that can bring us together. And on the other hand, they see it as kind of something that like, oh, well, if it happens, great. But if it doesn't happen, there's nothing really we can do about it. And I suppose most frustratingly is this idea that sport and politics cannot mix when fundamentally they're forever mixing. I'm currently reading Jonathan Wilson's The Power and the Glory, A New History of the World Cup, which I highly recommend. Lovely book. But he talks about how, from very early on, with founding of the World Cup, Jules Rimet having this very high-minded Corinthian ideal of, the World Cup bringing nations together, cutting across different countries and so on. Didn't entirely work out that way, of course, for those who don't know your history. First final of the World Cup, Uruguay defeat Argentina. The Uruguayan consulate in Buenos Aires is stoned by furious Argentinians who aren't too happy about it. So it's not quite bringing together international brotherhood there. But the point is that the tournament itself and FIFA and many of these other organizations were founded with a high-minded ideal of togetherness in mind. Now, that is fundamentally a political goal. If you are kind of... if you were seeing togetherness, international brotherhood, tolerance, and so on as an antidote to war, as an antidote to conflict, as an antidote to bigotry, well, that is a political stance. even if it's one that you think of as common sense, even if it's one that you think of that, oh, well, we all feel that really. It isn't an ideological thing. It still is a political stance. And it's incumbent, I think, on sports organizations to recognize that and to admit that they can't really ever separate sport from politics. Therefore, they must take a political stance, and that stance should be one led by a commitment to human rights.
Thank you. David.
So I'll pick up on my colleagues' threads in a quick minute, but I wanted to just start with a personal note because this is a meaningful moment for me. It's sort of a full circle moment. So I don't know if you picked up in the introduction, but I'm an alumnus of the University of Connecticut. And so just by a show of hands, how many students do we have here in the room? Great. I love to see it. So I just want you to imagine that in 30 years, and I'm dating myself, that I am you. So 30 years ago, I was a freshman on this campus when President Bill Clinton came to the dedication of the opening of the Dodd Center. And I can remember him in the Marine One helicopter landing on D-Lot at the football fields behind Hilltop. And it was quite a moment. So for me to come back here to be part of a conversation to speak on sports and human rights it's highly personal and deeply relevant for me. So just by way of background, I spent over a decade working at the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, where I engaged with members of Congress, various federal agencies, several administrations on issues at the intersection of human rights, sports diplomacy, where it intersects with sports, engaging with members of Congress, advocates like my colleague here, Minky, on these important issues. My tenure took me to 7 games, including the Russia Sochi Games in 2014, Rio de Janeiro 2016, and Beijing in 2022, where human rights issues were hard to ignore. They were urgent and they were in our face. So I want to be clear, I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, or do I even consider myself an expert in the field. However, I'm here as someone who's worked within the system to try to reconcile the ideals of sport with the political and commercial realities that shape it. So I think these conversations are important, but I want to kind of provide for this audience here what it's like when you're working on the inside of these organizations and how these issues are viewed. So to answer the original question, yes, it's absolutely important that athletes and fans use their voices to protect human rights and call out when sport is used to distract from or justify injustices. Their voices matter. But I believe real sustained progress starts with the leadership and the culture change at the executive level. Leaders in federations, leagues, clubs, and corporate sponsors, CEOs, should stop viewing human rights as a burden or a box to check and start treating these issues as a core responsibility of leadership. Too often, executives view human rights through a risk or reputational lens. It's how do we avoid the headline? How do we spin this? It becomes an exercise in communications and public relations. It happens every 2 years. We gather a group of our sponsors, their GR reps. We figure out what our messaging is, and we align. If we need to pull some levers within the government, we make calls to Capitol Hill. We find our champions to see where there could be cover. If there's opportunities for us to pull in a big name communications firm to give us further cover, or even to call some donors who are influential who can weigh in on the issue in the press, that's what we do. So I believe tangible change will only come when advocates and protectors hold real decision-making power, seats on boards, executive roles in companies, and even ownership stakes in clubs. Without that, we'll be stuck in statements rather than solutions. So what can we do? We can invest in education and accountability across the ecosystem. We can do a better job of educating the athletes, the staff, and the sponsors about the implications of human rights within sports. We can empower internal voices and external voices. Normalize transparency, publish impact assessments and lessons learned rather than waiting for crises to force disclosures. We can develop shared standards across leagues and federations so that accountability isn't optional or unevenly applied. And we can integrate human rights into governance and decision-making. We should include human rights expertise just like we do legal, finance, and marketing expertise. We go through these trainings biannually. We should have a human rights and safeguarding review and practices within our organizations. So I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation and discussing how we can move towards some real tangible change, because I will tell you the individuals who are making decisions within these institutions, they don't look like you and me. They do not necessarily view this as a responsibility. This is a safe place for all of us, and we're all nodding our heads as we make these statements. But I will tell you, these conversations fall flat within these institutions. And so we need to make some change to move the needle.
Thank you all for your opening comments. I want to pick up on a thread, and I know it's a comment and a theme that we've been talking about extensively throughout this summit, but I want to pick up the thread, Colm, you mentioned about questioning the role of the athlete, and Minky, you also have spoken a bit about the perception that athletes have a ton of power given their large platforms and the visibility they have, but in reality, it's a constrained power. And I want to hear from you all about what you think the role of the athlete in that context really is and can be.
So, I think that's a terrific question, and it has been a sub-theme of the entire conference. And I think we assume that athletes know what their human rights are, and we also don't realize that many of these athletes have started training when they're 12 to 15. They're Olympians at 17 to 19 or 20. So I think the expectation, first of all, that athletes are experts in human rights is unrealistic. Some athletes have lived experience of physical or other abuse. They have lived experience of being denied what we would recognize as a safe work environment, particularly women athletes, working conditions like concrete back turf in U.S. women's soccer, for example, has led to lifelong harms for athletes. So I think one of the solutions that I would have is actually that athletes really get specific information about their rights. Should you leave your cell phone at home when you go to, if you're an LGBT athlete, when you go to Saudi Arabia to play tennis? Or should you, as a female, what are your rights if you're going to play volleyball in Iran? So I think one very important thing that can be done is that athletes know that they can speak up individually, and that first they can speak up individually, but they don't have to. So that's the other thing, is athletes have a right not to speak up, especially if it involves personal danger. And one of the consequences of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, China, Russia, all of these major events going to places where basic human rights don't exist, one of the consequences of that is actual danger. So, we can't insist that, so there have been some athletes, for example, Lewis Hamilton, wearing a rainbow helmet when he was racing in the Formula One to speak out. He also wore the rainbow helmet in the United States. I think it's a very important thing to know that athletes can speak out, but they don't have to speak out. So they have the basic human right not to say something, especially if it would put them into physical jeopardy or actually harm their athletic performances. Just to the point about standards, I think increasingly the Premier League is putting in place human rights standards for ownership. So that's a positive step forward. It has happened after the ownership has already gone in some cases to people who couldn't pass a human rights test. But I would say, just on the athletes' rights piece, when Human Rights Watch has done quite a bit of research on stopping sexual and other abuse in sport, we have really leaned on the unions both leaning on in the sense of help with research and creating a safe and environment for athletes to speak up about abuse that they suffered, for example, or workplace abuse, but also leaning on the unions to provide pro bono legal support. If you're going to bring a claim against the president of your federation, you had better have good legal support and a way to actually bring forward anonymized testimony. So I will say that the collective piece of this is extremely important, but I think also a know your rights curriculum for athletes would be a really important step forward. We cannot assume that they know what their rights are, including their right not to speak up.
Thank you. Jules, did you want to add on?
Yeah, I love that. I would also just want to emphasize that even the incredible story that we heard last night and saw on the screen with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, they were part of a larger collective, the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which was part of an even larger collective, the Civil Rights Movement. And some people inside of the Olympic Project for Human Rights who were in those meetings decided not to go to the Olympics. I'm thinking of Lou Alcindor, who eventually became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So there were vigorous and rigorous conversations that were happening among athletes, guided by people who are in the know about politics and human rights, like Martin Luther King Jr. sat in on some of these conversations. So it has happened historically. Often that's kind of erased out of the story. It's just like two guys that like put their fist up. We all know better. But I'm saying that the collectivity of all this really matters a lot. And I totally co-sign what Mickey's saying about not all athletes should speak out. And I can say that from personal experience. I mean, you noted, Erica, in my bio, I played professional soccer for many years. I also played for the U.S. men's under-23 national team. And as part of that, I got asked, stories or questions by journalists for stories. And luckily, thank goodness, they only stuck to soccer because, I had thoughts at 19 that I was probably willing to share. And thank goodness I didn't get the opportunity. So, and now I think with social media, it's just a very perilous terrain. The other thing two other things really quick. One is that we don't often know when something becomes news, whether it was because of an athlete's agency. One example that I happened to be involved with myself was in the lead into the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. There was all the stress around the coronavirus. The International Olympic Committee was promising that everything was going to be okay. They were going to create this Olympic bubble. Side note, 800 people plus got COVID inside of the Olympic bubble. The Japanese population didn't want to hold it because they were under-vaccinated. In the meantime, 83%, I should say, of the Japanese population didn't want to hold the Olympics when they held it. Meantime, they sent this, and then they said, all you athletes are going to be safe, safe, safe. Don't you worry. But they sent to all the athletes that were participating in the Tokyo Olympics this waiver. And the waiver said, if you'd like to participate in the games, you have to agree that, one, if you die of COVID, you can't sue us. Jesus Christ. And two, if you die of heat exhaustion, you can't sue us. So, side note on the heat exhaustion, you ever wondered why they have the Olympics in July and August, like the two hottest months of the year? It's not because they love athlete health and want to keep everybody as safe as possible. It's because that's the open spot on the calendar for NBC that hands over billions of dollars to make the Olympics happen. And so it's hot in Tokyo. I've been there in July and August, and it is hot. So I took that information, an athlete leaked that document to me. They said, please take it to the press. I did. I took it to like the equivalent of 60 Minutes in Japan on the advice of some Japanese colleagues. And it became a little story, little tempest for a minute there. So, but no one would have the knowledge that it was actually an athlete that instigated that wanted to get it out into the world. And the last thing I would just say is like when Lewis Hamilton wears that helmet or when Megan Rapinoe stands up for trans rights, if you agree with them, we need to wrap around them because they are getting so much hate flung in their direction. So that's another thing we can do is that when someone does show the courage to stand up on principle, that we also show them the love.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to follow up on that. So as part of my work in the Tackling Online Hate Football project, what we done was we kind of combined huge quantitative data analysis of Twitter longitudinally from 2008 through 2022 with interviews with a lot of stakeholders about the evolving problem of online abuse, online harms, online hate in football or soccer. And one of the things we found in the interviews with ex-players we were doing, and I think interesting in the context of what we were saying earlier with, why aren't we seeing more modern high-profile athletes, and the question of money and so on, is obviously you might imagine that many ex-players who say would have played in maybe the 80s, 1990s, wouldn't have been paid quite as much as players are now, might have a touch of envy. Most, if not all of them, said, I thank God I'm not a player now, because the experience would be so much worse with the constant scrutiny and abuse I would be getting over social media. So, granted, like, it's not as if they can make the choice about when they wanted to play, but it's quite a powerful statement, I think, when you imagine that, like, if they were playing now, they'd be on vastly greater sums of money than when they were playing before, and speaks to the perception of what a chilling effect that online abuse can have on athletes speaking out. You mentioned like Megan Rapinoe, the US women's soccer team, Colin Kaepernick, like, these people get like enormous volumes of abuse off the back of athlete activism. We're now at, what is it, October 23rd, is it? Okay, so just a bit closer to my home than yours. Give it a week or so, and we'll get into November, and everyone in British public life will be wearing a poppy in commemoration of World War One. One man who won't will be James McLean, the Irish international, who currently plays the trade at Wrexham, and he will get death threats, abuse, letters saying he hoped, messages on social media saying they hope his children die in a fire and hope his wife gets sexually assaulted and so on. This happens like clockwork every November. When he used to play for Wigan in the Premier League, he published an open letter about his motivations, why growing up in Derry during the Troubles, having the British Army during Bloody Sunday kill many, innocent civilian protesters there. McLean made it clear that because sales of the poppy go to the British Legion, which funds anyone in the British Army, if it was just about commemorating the dead in World War I and World War II, he'd be happy to wear it, but he can't, knowing it goes to the same people who killed people in his community. At the time he done this was well over a decade ago. Dave Whelan, the then owner of Wigan Athletic, who had been initially quite critical of him, in fairness said, "Oh, okay, I understand your motivations now. I get it." So despite this, him publishing that letter and getting the kind of like agreement of his owner, the owner of the club at the time, he still just gets abused like clockwork, like every November for this, what on the scale of it, is a very small bit of activism. He's not openly demonstrating. He's just not wearing this emblem that everyone else is. And he gets enormous abuse for it. So, athletes who kind of put their head above the parapet for whatever cause it might be, suffer enormous abuse through social media. And particularly as athletes are kind of outside of the absolute elite of their sports, they essentially have to be on social media when it comes to gathering a following and attaining sponsorship and so on. This is particularly the case for a lot of female athletes we spoke to. They said one of the first questions sponsors asked them is, what's your follower count? It's not about their playing abilities. It's not about the things they've won the pitch. It's like, do you have a big following on social media? This will then facilitate them getting sponsorship and supporting themselves and their families and so on. So it's not something they can easily opt out of. It's sort of a vicious cycle. They are forced to swim in the sea they're drowning in. And they don't receive a lot of support from clubs and major institutions about this. Essentially, a lot of the training goes as far as don't say anything that might get you in trouble. Like, just don't say anything political, which isn't incredibly helpful. And again, it certainly doesn't encourage them to, be an activist in any way if they're just being told by their clubs, don't speak up. So I think what would be needed to help athletes in this case is much greater support from the structures around them, the franchises, the clubs that they play for, in terms of like emotional and legal support of the abuse they will inevitably get over social media if they participate in any kind of activism. Now, in the research myself and my colleagues have done, we've spoken to a lot of academy players, like, under 18 junior players. Some of them, and a lot of them are teenage boys, had much more success in getting male academy players than females for various reasons. You can imagine speaking to a lot of teenage boys, they're not very willing to say, yeah, it was really emotionally tough, the thought of getting abused, and I don't want to do that. Of course they don't. We're speaking to them in groups. I don't care. I'm going to get paid loads. I don't care. But few of them that do have spoken about it, and particularly the older lads that will be about 18 and will be kind of on the public radar that they would have suffered a bit of abuse themselves. Some of them have admitted that it does affect their performance. Now, from our case, not enough that we can really base any research around it. But this, unfortunately, I think is the very utilitarian calculus we have to work in, where the clubs, the teams, all they care about from these athletes is whether they perform on the field or not, and earn more money and so on. if we can make the case that the online abuse they suffer will impact on their performance, then maybe that will motivate the teams to give them better support against the emotional distress they will encounter from suffering online abuse. Unfortunately, it will probably also encourage them to further discourage the athletes from any form of activism. But anything that gets us further along the road towards these, often very wealthy, often very well-resourced organizations giving some form of proper support to their to the athletes in their employ.
I would answer the question by saying, the best thing that we can do is empower athletes. Today's athlete, any student athletes in the room? What's the one thing, and you don't have to answer this, but in working with athletes, especially in today's day and age, athletes want as much information as they can have before they do anything. They want all the data. And so I'll narrowly focus on how we manage the situation with the Team USA athletes going into the Winter Games in Beijing in 2022. So for those who are not familiar, there were the human rights issue was the suppression of the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang region. Lots of members of Congress, several advocates were calling on Team USA athletes to speak up. Either they should boycott, they should be speaking out on social media and using their platform to advocate on behalf of this group of individuals. From our perspective, and we like to say we're the team behind the team at the USOPC, our goal was, so how can we support the athletes by providing as much information as possible? So we worked with the State Department into bringing experts to provide briefings. We worked with Minky here from Human Rights Watch to really give them everything that they needed so that they could make an educated decision on how they wanted to proceed. I remember Michaela Schifrin, one of the most decorated, one of our top skiers in this country. She was very, very interested in this issue. And I don't even know, did she follow up with you?
Yeah.
She was able to, and she has a huge following. So everything she says socially, and she has agents who can tell her, and she has the PR people, but she had the information because we went out and gave her data. We gave her all of the different issues, sub-issues that were going on so that she could make an educated decision and move forward. And I think that's what we can do is athletes want to be able to speak up, but they're not going to do so if they don't have all the information. And we as institutions, we're going to fail them if we're not at least giving them the resources to do so.
Thank you. I have two kind of broad questions that I want to throw out there. Take this off. And the first one, David, I'm going to pitch to you, but you're speaking to the reality of the environment within these organizations and the constraints that exist there, and that these arguments often fall flat or, aren't necessarily taken well or taken seriously in those spaces. You cited having more diversity in the leadership roles and changing those cultures. How do you, based on your experience and based on what you see there, how do you suggest we do that work to change the kind of culture within the institutions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I wouldn't say that these issues aren't taken seriously. I mean, they are, and that's why you see organizations arming up and bringing in lobbyists and bringing in PR reps, because it becomes a defensive exercise. But I think the one thing that you can do that speaks their language is you talk to the economic bottom line. I mean, that's really what speaks to these individuals. It's when shareholders are starting to make calls, when donors to these organizations are starting to question the actions of the organization and say, are you living up to the values that I believe in? And so when you can show best practices on how other organizations may have managed similar situations, and if your organization is doing something completely opposite, corporate executives are going to start to listen. So it really comes down to that bottom line and the economics behind it, because all these folks are really in it is really to raise the bottom line and make money. I mean, I hate to say that, But within these organizations, you're going to have people who are non-revenue generating units. So the people that oversee sustainability, the folks that oversee human rights, people that do government affairs like my team, but we're not a revenue generating unit. And so when what we say doesn't get as much attention as the folks who are in fundraising or the folks who are in marketing, the people who are controlling those budgets, they're the ones that get all the air. So you really dials back to, the dollar at the end of the day.
Thank you. I wanted to open up to our other three panelists, either in response to that question or if you have something else you'd like to comment on.
Just very quickly, David has it absolutely right on sports governance. So every major human rights problem that we've discussed today and on previous panels dates back to what can only be called shitty governance. It wouldn't meet, sports is the last place in the world that has there's been a longstanding problem of federation presidents marrying, having children with athletes. I mean, the lack of representation for women, for LGBT people, athletes running these federations is a big part of this. And by federations, I want you all to imagine this enormous infrastructure where you have the IOC on top, but then below you have incredibly powerful federations like FIFA that are themselves, FIFA is going to have a $11 billion windfall from the last two World Cups. And that is not being returned to local communities. So each of these federations, whether it's, for basketball, FIBA, the Global Basketball Federation, is on top of the NBA and the WNBA. But are there, as WNBA players are negotiating a CBA for a living wage, where are the women inside FIBA? There are hardly any women inside FIBA, the Basketball Federation. Where do they look to for inspiration and support? So I would say human rights, these federations are the last place that has adopted basic, what we would call workplace standards. So we've talked a lot about the World Cup in the United States. The Women's World Cup is coming up in 2027 in Brazil. At the last World Cup and the Women's World Cup in 2023 and 2019, women players were not even guaranteed a salary for playing in qualifying tournaments. Women were made, at the 2019 World Cup, the U.S. women's national team had to sue their own federation going into that World Cup. They're making, I think, 7.5% of what the men make in tournament pay. Obviously, FIFA could equalize that tomorrow, but they're choosing not to do so. Where we have seen progress has been where women like Cindy Cohn, former U.S. women's national team player, is actually running U.S. soccer. So where we've seen progress for pay equity, or with the Australian men's and women's national teams, where the players' union was headed by both a male and a female, men and women. So I think one other thing I wanted to say is, on players' rights, a lot of players are now feeling pressure to go to places like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. And it's fine to go and take the money, but there's nothing that says you have to sacrifice your free speech. So if a condition of playing in Saudi Arabia or the UAE or another country, China, is that you are silent about the human rights abuses in that country, that's a violation of your human rights. You do not have to agree to remain silent or to, like the comedians at the Riyadh Comedy Festival, you don't have to refrain from talking about women's rights activists who are in jail not so far from where you're performing. So the problem is not athletes going to repressive places. It's actually athletes going and remaining silent about the abuses, or frankly, comedians as well.
I just wanted to jump in real quick, because what you're seeing now is sometimes they're not allowed to enter the country. You're seeing visa bans, or they're using visas as an instrument that to suppress the voice of people who are dissenting. So there's a question of whether or not that's going to happen here in the United States next summer. But you're seeing several countries around the world that are saying, if you speak up on these issues, we're not going to give you a visa. And that was a big concern for us in 2022. The athletes were concerned, like if I have something on my social media from 3 years ago protesting against, some sort of injustice, am I going to be allowed into China? And so that's a real concern for these folks. The other thing I would say is there are folks who so in the case of Beijing, there were Chinese Americans who had family in China. And so even if they chose to speak up, are they putting their family in jeopardy? And so these are all concerns that athletes have when they make decisions on whether or not, they do want to speak up. So,
Colm, did you have something to add?
I suppose just when it comes to institutions, particularly to that point of investment-based sports washing you brought up earlier, when you have autocratic regimes buying into major sports teams and clubs, I think part of what complicates this for fans, for journalists, is when the previous institutions there were incredibly flawed already. So to take, for example, in the case of Newcastle United, the English soccer team is now owned by the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund. Their previous owner, Mike Ashley, he's like a dreadful person on many levels. He runs kind of a sports clothing brand with the conditions for the workers within the UK are horrible. But also he was a terrible owner of Newcastle United, spent feck all money, seemed to have no ambition for the club. So that created this vacuum whereby like the fans of the club were sort of any port in a storm, like anyone who was going to come in and rescue them from Mike Ashley would be seen in the best possible light. So when the initial attempt by the Saudi PIF to buy Newcastle was blocked by the UK government, there was a petition with tens of thousands of signatures sent to the UK government that was incredibly well researched and kind of pointing out all the UK's existing diplomatic and economic ties with Saudi Arabia and how, all the great work Saudi Arabia is doing in the Gulf region and so on, and how hypocritical it is to stop them from getting a presence and owning a Premier League club. Now, all of this seems quite kind of like laughable when we think of all the human rights abuses that go on in Saudi Arabia, but it's coming from a context whereby if you're a Newcastle fan seeing your club being run into the ground by this sort of corrupt individual who doesn't seem to have any accountability to any football authorities, like the so-called fit and proper persons tests that existed for the ownership of English soccer clubs was has long been regarded as a joke. Like anyone, you or I, if we had any money, could kind of waltz in there and buy it sight unseen. There's very little kind of accountability in that sense. So when you have these already flawed institutions, I think it complicates the conversation around sports washing regimes when they come in from the outside. They're not seen by everyone as unilaterally bad because they're contrasted with what existed there before. When we done our paper on Manchester City fans, we found a lot of them on these fan forums kind of complaining about the existing structures within English and European football that essentially enshrined inequality, ensured that only a small group of what they refer to as the cartel clubs, meaning the kind of traditional big powers, your Manchester Uniteds, Liverpools, Real Madrid, so on, got richer and they sort of, their prism for any kind of critique of the ownership of Man City was seeing it as, this is the cartel clubs just policing their territory because we are threatening them with our success. And on one level, you're reading that and you think, well, that's probably true. It's probably a much more of a concern to the ownership of Man United or Real Madrid or Juventus that Man City are really good at football, than that their owners commit, or a regime related to human rights abuses. So while that is true, it's also it is quite specious of you, whatever Manchester City fan on this message board, as a human being, to be ignoring the fact that these human rights abuses happen at all and focusing solely on the existing inequalities within football structures as a way of avoiding talking about human rights abuses. So all of that is to say, I suppose, that the existing flaws within sporting systems kind of allow for sports washing to flourish, basically, for it to be seen as, in a world where if we were to have equitable and fair sporting structures and we see this kind of autocratic regime coming in from the outside, it will be a lot easier to mobilize resistance to that among fans, among athletes, among journalists, among officials, done in a very flawed context where the sports washers just seem like, they're the worst of a bad bunch, but maybe, let he who's without sin cast the first stone and all that. It's kind of, complicates the conversation around it when you already have a very flawed institution there. So, there's very much a need for these institutions to get their own houses sorted out if they are to properly defend themselves against being leveraged for sports washing.
Thank you. And Jules, do you want to comment on those remarks?
I just want to make a quick aside because of the comments this morning before they sort of get etched into stone and brought down from above about we all have a price. I want to kind of push back against that. Do we? Must we?
And I agree, totally agree with Jules. And just one actually point of factual clarification. So Human Rights Watch did the original reporting about the Riyadh Comedy Festival. We wrote to every comedian who was taking part, and we encouraged them. It's not to go. We encourage them to actually go and take advantage of your freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia that ordinary citizens don't have. Speak up about women's rights defenders in jail who've been tortured. Speak up about the execution of juvenile offenders. Speak up about the modern day slavery system where millions of migrant workers toil in dangerous conditions. And not a single one of the comedians took us up on it. Aziz Ansari said on Jimmy Kimmel that he was going to give a donation to Human Rights Watch to make up for going there and not raising human rights issues. And we rejected his donation. So it's not true that everyone has a price. I think it's very important. There's no price on free speech. So just a slight correction in case there was any confusion there. We did not take the money.
Oh, thank you. Well, barring any other responses, or do you want to respond?
It's not so much a response, but are we going to turn to questions?
We were going to turn, but please.
No, because I have a question,
Okay.
and I don't know the answer to.
David,
So
first question.
if I could ask the first question, is when it comes to sports washing, is it the fact that we in the United States don't necessarily understand the underlying atrocities that take place in these countries because they're foreign to us? So I'll make the analogy to the NBA. The NBA is very forward-leaning to civil injustices here in the United States. They provide training for their players. The big stars are speaking out on these issues. You saw this around the George Floyd movement. But they're also in Rwanda. And you don't hear the players with the same energy speaking out about the NBA's relationship with that country. But I wonder, because I did some research and I see what's going on, there's a suppression of the opposition of opposite politicians. Is sports washing something that occurs because it's foreign to us here in the United States? And maybe if we understood the issues better, and maybe that'll come clearer because it's happening here. So it's not going to seem so foreign because it's actually, once you experience it, you'd say, okay. But I guess my question for the panel, is that part of the reason why sports washing seems to be flourishing is because we here in the West don't necessarily understand the underlying atrocities?
So, this is the beauty of the system of the international framework of business and human rights it is a human rights due diligence framework. And I think it's, especially for those of you who are studying human rights, it's been around since 2011. Human rights and non-discrimination existed in the sports structures and even the Olympic Charter before then. But I think especially in the age of the internet, you are able, I didn't bring a copy of it, but you're able to access FIFA, for example, can access this report about, it's called Die First and I'll Pay You Later, about wage theft and preventable deaths of migrant workers constructing things like stadiums in Saudi Arabia. So in this age, it is impossible to say that you don't know that the Rwanda-backed M23 is committing horrors against the civilian population in eastern Congo. They've taken over Bukavu. So it's impossible to say that you don't know that opposition politicians are jailed in Rwanda or that journalists are targeted for killings. So I think human rights due diligence can be as easy as, did you run an internet search to see what did Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch have to say about this country? We publish constantly updated information. So I think it's really that you don't want to know that your partners are committing atrocities at the same time you're hosting. The UCI brought the World Cycling Championship to Rwanda in September. So your partners the government is also responsible for backing militias that are committing horrible crimes, including rapes and killings against a civilian population not very far from your racetrack. So I think that's really the problem. And it's Human Rights Watch takes the position the UCI should, if you're going to Rwanda with your tournament, you have an obligation to take these matters up with the government. You're spending more time than any of us will have with Paul Kagame. So you have an obligation to bring up these human rights abuses, express your concern, and ask the government to deal with them. So it's not that you can never go to Saudi Arabia. It's that you have an obligation, if you're FIFA, to put in place labor unions, to work with the government to put in place life insurance for the families of workers who are going to die delivering your event.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question you posed, David. And first, on the Rwanda situation, I just think there's a real lack of knowledge in our country where we are right now on that. And there's a really good film that just came out. Mark Wainaru Wada put out. It's on YouTube, actually. If you look up Sportswashing in Rwanda, it's like 30-minute, like really nice breakdown of some of the dynamics that David was describing. And I highly recommend it. I think we're reaching a real pivotal moment in the United States right now on so many levels. And there's a lot of people that are really kind of grasping to try to figure out how to get a handle on everything. It's happening so fast. I mean, I was just reflecting yesterday, October 22nd, on how only 3 months prior, on June 22nd, the United States bombed Iran. That was 3 months ago. When I looked at that, I couldn't believe that was just 3 months ago. Like the sheer abundance of mayhem that is this whirling swirl of the Trump administration kind of makes it difficult to wrap your hands around something, let alone if you consider yourself to be an apolitical sports fan. And we all know who those folks are. We have them in our lives. But I think we're reaching this really interesting moment where these upcoming sports mega events, if we talk about them through the lens of politics and sports washing, if you want, can be a really great way of talking to people who otherwise don't want to talk about what's happening, and really get a good handle on the seriousness of the situation. And at the same time, demonstrating that the United States is part of a global system. We can't just waggle a finger at those other, capital O, other people out there, and that we have a situation right here that we can still do something about. I mean, let me just say, last thing I'll say on this question is that if you think about it, if you're not like curious or even speaking out at this point, like when are you going to do it? Because we have more power right now than we're going to have in a few days, because they're not stopping with what they're doing from the national government. So if we wait, you're just going to be weaker. You wait a little longer, you're going to be weaker. Then you have the excuse, well, now I'm really weak. So what I'm saying is, like, we actually have power now. We can still speak out without being jailed. I got let back in the country when I came from Finland the other day, so I'm happy to report. So, we can do this, and I believe it behooves us to do so in this moment.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions. We already have many hands in the air. I'm going to start with Gigi right here. You were first up.
Thank you, guys. This has been really great. And I have to ask a bit of a cheeky question because we're talking about sports washing, and we kind of keep dancing back and forth between the sports body and the athletes. But what we haven't brought up is Rule 50. We haven't brought up that there are actually rules that muzzle
athletes. And so I don't think we can, really put anything at the feet of athletes. And Zoe talked about that. So I'd love to hear the thoughts from the panel. Sure. And really it goes to earlier Pablo's comments about we want these games to happen. That's why, there's a real reticence to call for boycotts, because we want it to happen so that we have the platform and we can get in there and put these messages. But then we've got these like little pushbacks, these big pushbacks that we haven't figured out, and we're not really intellectually being honest about it.
I can start with that one. So just backing up, Rule 50 is a rule in the Olympic Charter that states that athletes cannot engage in political activity basically at the Olympic Games. So it came about in the wake of a couple historical events. One of them we learned about last night in great detail. Smith and Carlos, fist in the air. Wyoming Tayus wearing different colored shorts and standing in solidarity with them. Then a couple years later, we had two gentlemen stand on the medal stand at 1972 Olympics, Wayne Collette and Vincent Matthews. They looked very disinterested. They kind of were waiting during the national anthem. They both stood on the same podium, which was really interesting. Like they didn't have one higher than the other. A breach of Olympic protocol. And then the guy kind of just one of them spun his medal on his finger while the national anthem was playing. They looked really bored. They were banned for life by the Olympics, only recently reinstated. One of them was already dead, unfortunately. But in the wake of those two incidents, that's when the IOC created these rules, which now is Rule 50, which bans political speech on the part of athletes. Well, this is in fundamental clashing with UN principles that allow for such thing as open speech like that. But it's also been challenged by athletes, and the International Olympic Committee has bent the rules a little bit. Now they're like, okay, yeah, you can't do it when you're on the actual playing field, but you can do it when you're, at a press conference, you can talk politics to your heart's content. And definitely not anywhere involving the actual sporting side of things. But they're so inconsistent in how they apply it. Raven Saunders at the Tokyo Olympics won a silver in shot put, and she put her arms like this to symbol, and in the shape of an X to symbolize the oppressed people around the world, as she described it, on the medal stand, clearly making a political statement. And the IOC was like, meh. I mean, I'm glad they didn't come down on it, don't get me wrong, but it was like very different approach. Heraskevich, the Ukrainian slider, came down and held up a sign, said no war on Ukraine, very political. They're like, meh, no worries. So it's like they kind of almost are acknowledging that some politics are sort of okay sometimes and some not. So we're in a really interesting liminal moment with that. And the more athletes challenge this, I think the more it's only going to change. And the only reason it's changed is because athletes have challenged it. And one last thing before I pass the mic here is I was right when I said that thing about we have this duty to stand up, I was like, who's we anyways, man? like me, I have to admit, I've got a lot of middle-aged white guy cisness to me. So it's easier for me to say that. I just want to acknowledge that is the reality. It's not easy for everybody to just stand up and be glad they got back into Finland. So I just want to make a little clarification.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have a strong opinion about this. I just wanted to say that actually athletes don't surrender their human rights to free speech at any point. And so it's actually not a right that can be restricted. So just first of all, that's, and free speech, of course, is the right that protects all others. And I do want to say that it's just to your point about who's speaking and what they're saying. I think it has especially been athletes and others from communities that have experienced human rights abuses who are most likely to speak up and are most in need of the podium, the literal podium that the Olympics provides. And I want to give the example here from the Paris Olympics. Afghan women and girls alone in the world, 20 million of them are banned from all sports, from school and from the workplace, right? So there is a complete violation of the Olympic Charter in that regard. And yet they were present at the Paris Olympics, both on the national team and on the refugee Olympic team. One of the athletes, the breakdancer on the refugee Olympic team, took advantage of the opportunity. I wish I could throw up the picture now to say free Afghan women on the back of a cape that she unfurled. And that's the classic example of someone who has no rights and no voice deliberately within the Taliban system using the Olympic podium to speak out. And certainly she should not have been punished and excluded from the Olympic Village and treated poorly by the Olympic system. She should be seen as the same sort of hero that John Carlos and Tommy Smith are.
But she was punished. Yeah.
And she was punished, and obviously we issued a press release saying that's bad. But these are people who have no voice deliberately within the system, including within the sporting system. So it's more necessary for athletes from those from a background of experiencing human rights abuse that they have that opportunity. And I would say also as a refugee, right? These are the people most likely to need the sports podium.
both of you have already spoken on this so well. We've got a lot of questions, so I won't add anything further for the time being.
David, you wanted to respond.
Yeah, I'll just I would add that Rule 50 it's evolving, and I'll admit it is arbitrary in a sense that from the difference between 2018 to 2020 within the USOPC, we created a Rule 50 committee that we could convene whenever there was a question of whether or not an athlete had committed a violation. So at the games, it's a group of, generally it's like 5 individuals with input and stakeholders from the athlete voice. So we have either someone from the athlete leadership committee, we'll have an alumni. We had Tommy Smith and John Carlos actually come in and consult us on what this different sort of how are we going to determine if an act is in violation of Rule 50, and because it's kind of a gray area, there's what it came down to is we advocated for there needed to be a place for athletes to be able to express their opinions. And that's where the IOC came around to can't happen on the podium, can't happen on the field of play. But then they created a space within the mix zone, which is the area where the athletes go after they coming from the field of play to do media before they do drug testing. And so they could do it there. And so I think that's where we are today with it. And it seems to be generally something that the athletes are grateful for. But it is an evolving space. So we'll see where we are in 2028.
Let's go. Let's get a student question. How about right here? And then we'll go back here.
So this is a soccer history question that kind of relates to today. So I don't know if you want to take it or if Richard wants to take it. But with Barcelona and Real Madrid being two of the most famous and supported teams in world football, their rivalry stems from political issues, with Real representing Spanish unity with its alignment with Francisco Franco, the dictator, and his background on Catalan identity, and Barcelona representing the Catalan independence movement, with said rivalry representing these clashing ideals of identities of the Catalan people versus the Spanish regime, and at the time of its peak, against Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, who sought to get rid of the Catalan identity and created a united Spain. It is similar to sports washing in the sense of 2026 World Cup benefiting the image of Donald Trump and his policies on identity being pushed on America, or does it differ?
Well, I think all these cases are unique in and of themselves while differing. There's certainly a case of sports washing under Franco in the sense of the Copa del Rey, which is now the national cup competition in Spain, was the Copa del Generalissimo, and Franco was there. It was a cup for him. And you had, he's a kind of an odd fella, Franco, in that he wanted this very, he was a dictator by definition, odd fella. He wanted this very kind of culturally homogenous Spain, which for any of you where of Spain, you've got the Basques, the Catalans, the Andalusians, a lot of different cultures and languages there. But at the same time, he really loved the Basque culture and kind of saw it as the most redolent of Spanish culture. So nowadays, soccer, Spain is associated with tiki-taka and very kind of pretty football with a lot of very small, skinny midfielders. Really up until the late 90s, Spanish football was seen as was called La Furia, where it was all about being really hard and just kind of laying into people. And this was kind of based out of a sort of Basque conception of doing things that Franco was very in favor of, despite his mission to culturally homogenize Spain and stamp out any form of Basque or Catalan autonomy or anything like that. So that's certainly a kind of a sports washing case, albeit within a domestic sphere. And you could argue, and some critics have argued, that Barcelona themselves would value their status as representing the Catalan people. Franco's decision to allow them to continue to function throughout his regime in Spain was a way of kind of maybe neutering a more violent form of Catalan dissent. That if you are a proud Catalan and you're living under a dictator who wants to stamp that identity out, but you can go to the new camp every weekend and, cheer your heart out, maybe this acts as a bit of a release valve on emotions that otherwise might build up and see you committed to some kind of violent resistance against Franco. Now, look, we cannot run a test on what would have happened if, he had a stamped Barcelona, so you can't know that for sure. And they certainly played a huge role in preserving that Catalan identity that might have otherwise gone away. I hadn't really thought of it in direct connection with Trump and the sense of, I suppose, this idea of figures, leaders within countries seeing any form of identity politics, any form of what would be called like hyphenated identity, you know, African American, Arab American, whatever, as sort of watering down the central identity and a threat to unity. But I think you're onto something there. I think that you definitely can draw lines. It's a similar kind of line of argument. It's this idea that, like, for this country to be strong, we all have to have the exact same conception of what it means to be an American, what it means to be a Spaniard. And if you are, you know, if your idea is different than the mainstream, then that is somehow threatening or undermining it. You know, which I would argue the exact opposite. I would think, like, to me, the great paradox at the heart of like a lot of far right nationalism is that they purport to love the country, but the version of that country's identity they celebrate is this incredibly rigid, fragile, unimaginative thing compared to the much sort of richer, diverse form of identity you could accommodate through letting these other identities like Catalan Spaniards, Basque Spaniards, African Americans, Arab Americans kind of into that picture. So yeah, it's not something that I had thought of to connect before, but I think it's a really good point you raised. I think they absolutely are kind of pulling from the same central idea as what the national identity should be and how sport should relate to that.
Maybe, so we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe we can collect a couple of questions and take them at once. Let's go in the back, Yetza, and then remind me, sorry, right behind. Red. Start there.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I have 3 questions. Is that okay?
Let's pick one.
Okay. All right. So I really appreciated some of the cultural nuance that David was trying to introduce, and I just wanted to. I do agree that athletes do need data. On the question of knowledge and beliefs. So a few years ago, we constructed an athletes' rights survey that tested athletes' knowledge of their human rights in sport and separately their beliefs, because knowledge is not the same thing as beliefs. We know from the human rights or from the human behavior change science that beliefs actually are what drive behavior, and standing up for your rights is a behavior. So what we found is that out of about 1,200 athletes from 70 different countries and 44 sports, 90% knew exactly what their rights were. Check yes, 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 yes. Whereas lower than 40% actually had any kind of confidence or belief that they could take action against those rights without very serious repercussions. So my question is really, number one, how do you respond to that data? Because obviously it's not a question of knowledge. Knowledge exists on the internet, is information that's out there, and not everybody has the genuine belief or even contextual cultural experience to action that knowledge. And that's much more important when it comes to behavior change. So I think in this setting, when we're talking about a culturally nuanced discussion, which I really appreciate David trying to bring that up, we really need to consider from the athlete's perspective the difference, and the data does clearly show there is a difference and just discordance between knowledge and beliefs. I would love the response, particularly from Human Rights Watch, of that study, because it was a big one, and it did show that athletes have great knowledge of their rights, but not necessarily confidence to action it. Worse for women, worse for disabled, worse for Black and brown.
I'll just do it.
Now.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll just do a quick response to that, which is to say, I think we've talked about the repercussions of, on athletes, and obviously we have the example. We had the example in the room of John Carlos and Tommy Smith, but I think we haven't really talked about what that looks like for athletes. And it almost, particularly when you're, for example, reporting sexual abuse or labor abuse, or a discrimination for LGBT athletes. What Human Rights Watch has documented, and we've also interviewed hundreds of athletes, is the first thing that happens is you are likely to lose your career. And that means that in the case of athletes we've interviewed in Mali or Haiti or Japan, you actually are losing your economic future. Sport is an opportunity to get scholarships. The 17-year-old survivors of abuse in Mali were on the women's under 18 national team. They lost their chance to play in the WNBA, to play in France, to go to school, to have a business. So I think for a lot of the athletes, even if you know your rights, rights, asserting your rights is very difficult in this very corrupt structure that we have for the federations, for the National Olympic Committees. And I would really recommend that everyone in the room, if you haven't seen it already, to watch Athlete A, which is one of several outstanding documentaries about the so-called Olympic doctor Larry Nassar. And the athletes and the Olympians who came forward with criminal complaints against him were ignored by the then USOC, the FBI, worse, the FBI, University of Michigan, and all of the actors that were supposed to protect the athletes. And the main thing that happened is people lost their careers. So I have interviewed athletes who were Nassar whistleblowers, and one of the athletes, Jessica Howard, who had been a national champion in rhythmic gymnastics, also served on the board of USA Gymnastics. And she's said, and I think she said this publicly as well, that it was not the abuse that was the most traumatizing for her. It was actually the treatment she got from her sport, from USA Gymnastics, for being a whistleblower. And I think until we solve that problem of having rights is of no benefit whatsoever if you can't assert them within a corrupt, patriarchal, and poor governance system. So all of the reforms that we've seen in schools, that we've seen in business, that we've seen in academia, have not made its way to sport. It's called the so-called autonomy of sport, and people around the world will tell you that these abuses are normalized because the sport power system. So it's a power differential where the athletes have no power whatsoever, and they rarely make it into the power structure. But when they do, we see a real difference.
Thank you. Okay, we've got time for one more question in about 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to go back to what we were talking about earlier and more domestic cases of sports washing. If sports washing is the making of absurd times and incredible human rights abuses as more normal, we are most definitely living through them. As almost, I don't know the numbers, but incredible amounts of people within our country do not have access to basic healthcare and abortions. We are witnessing incredible assaults on education in the form of academics with like African American studies, queer studies, and the studies of all marginalized backgrounds. These are identities that don't just exist. The athletes themselves are not just athletes. There are these people that are being attacked within the system, and especially within the college NCAA landscape. It's a more than $1 billion industry, and we, as a former NCAA athlete, when participating, continue making our society seem like it's business as usual. And the question to you guys is, how do we give athletes the idea that we do have agency? And right now, as you were saying, Jules, we have the most agency that we will have for the foreseeable future. And how do we get people to not act as athletes, but to act as people that are currently and actively being threatened with incredible oppression?
Colm, do you want to take it?
I'll jump in. I think we have to be somewhat strategic about it. Like you identified, there were like a lot of ongoing. I'm conscious that like the three Americans here, the foreigner speaks up. Here's what you should do with your country, America. But you identified like a lot of ongoing issues, and inequalities. And from a moral point of view, they're all in need of addressing. But in terms of kind of athletes, working together towards, drawing, I suppose, getting away from this perception of business as usual as normalization and drawing attention towards one of them, that while morally they're all worthy of addressing, strategically it will be more effective to say, like, pick one cause and simply, and that be the line that triggers organized athlete protests about something. And we've seen this obviously, in your civil rights movement here, like the Rosa Parks bus case was, very much a strategy as much as anything else, and a very effective one to kind of raise awareness for that. So in that sense, it seems quite cynical to think about it this way, but it's about like picking your battles to a degree too. Most recently, we were talking about La Liga, and the last question, you had the Spanish footballers protesting against the movement of one of the games to Miami, and they were successful in that, and that has temporarily stopped it. And their protest was for the first 15 seconds of the games in the preceding weekend, they wouldn't play. And again, it's very focused, it's a very visible form of protest, like anyone tuning in could not fail to see it. It's very connected to one single issue. Now, I'm sure like their motivations for protesting that are based on deeper lying things of feelings of being kind of exploited or overworked or so on in the efforts to monetize and grow the league. But it's a very kind of clear issue where, like, what do we want? We don't want this game in Miami. And sure enough, they got it. So I think for athletes in the US, while there's so many ongoing injustices in need of addressing, it would be, I think, more useful for them to pick a sort of single cause, a single flashpoint event, as it were, and strategically organize group protests around that. And that be the wedge issue, for want of a better word, that you draw attention to, rather than a more wide-reaching gestures about how bad things are. While that would be true, I don't think it would be as effective.
Can I push back on that? So, as we were talking about with yesterday and the U.S. protests and boycotts of people they didn't have just one cause, they have multiple. And there was the removal of air cartage, the participation of Rhodesia and South Africa, and other issues. And I think that we can walk and shoot on the Liberty. I don't fucking roast that one yet. And I think that definitely there are some teams that have more identities that can unite on similar fronts, but I think that especially within, whether it's not just, I limited if I should go point out the NCAA, but I mean WNBA teams that are based in cities and states where people would have to travel thousands of miles in order to see an abortion, or where they hit the question of like gay marriage is coming up. That's not something that you can't separate it from other things. And I think that is, how do you get people to understand that we are all being oppressed by societies? And part of that is the fact that intertwined with the discussion and the WNBA, the pay discrepancies and all the class offices.
Yeah, so just to tackle briefly, because I don't want to monopolize too much of speaking time here. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a fair counterpoint. The demonstration in 1968 was much more diffuse, and I'm speaking kind of from a point of view of like my own feelings on this. It's not like I've organized mass protests that I can point to as a success. So what I'm saying here is more based around like my opinion than it is anything kind of greatly informed. I suppose I'd say two things. One, I'm not saying that you would necessarily have to protest one issue at the expense of all of the others. I'm saying, but more that you organize one protest around a given issue, then you could protest around another one, and so on. But two, I would argue that the forces you are protesting against have grown more sophisticated in their ability to cloud the discourse around issues, and they have more weapons at hand in terms of like social media. And as we've seen, a lot of the people who run these major tech platforms are quite pally with the people in power. So their ability to muddy the waters around the conversation about, rights is more, I think, powerful and more sophisticated than it was in 1968. And from that sense, I think it would be more effective to focus on like single issues at a given time that are much harder for them to distort into with disinformation and with things that essentially like water down the efforts that these hypothetical protests would be trying to achieve. But as I said, that's just my opinion based on what I've seen. Time, I hope, will tell what the most effective form of protest is in this day and age. I just hope we see some form of protest to judge that.
Unfortunately, I think we have to close there of just watching the time. But I want to thank you all for your expertise, and I want to thank you all for being so engaged and have questions. I highly encourage you throughout the rest of the summit to interact with the speakers, ask questions that you have that you weren't able to in this space, and just want to thank you all.
Thank you all for being here. It's been a very full day. We would love to see you come back tomorrow. Summit starts at 9 o'clock with a keynote address from Danielle Umstadt, Paralympian ski racer. It continues with panels on business, sport, and human rights, and a very special afternoon panel featuring former UConn athletes speaking about how their lives post-UConn, like David's, have intersected with issues of human rights. If you need more incentive, free breakfast from 8 to 9, join us. But thank you for being here.